Hi, everyone, and welcome to this mini lecture on school structure. By structure, I mean how the education system is organized, funded, and staffed. We'll briefly touch on the history of education and how it ties into issues with school structure today, the evolving role of government in schooling, and the hierarchy and staffing of school districts. Let's look at a little bit of history. In terms of structure, schooling that began in the American colonies varied widely by region. What passed for public education, if available at all, was controlled at the local level. Basically, the purpose of education was to produce literate citizens that could make the new democracy function. However, in the southern colonies, there was no public school option, and wealthy white children were educated privately. Of course, there was no central or state government control at that time because, well, we did not yet have central or state governments, right? Teachers were usually local clergymen or politicians, and curricula was basic reading and arithmetic. Let's look at government for a minute. One of the cultural influences on education since those early times until the present has been some form of government. Let's look a bit more closely at the role of government today by branch and level. As you know, branches include legislative, executive, and judicial, and levels include federal, state, and local. I know, this sounds like a civics class, doesn't it? So, at the federal level, we have appointed leaders, including the Secretary of Education and the professional staff of the U.S. Department of Education. One of the most important functions of the federal government is protection of civil rights. I hope this makes sense because civil rights are constitutional rights, yes. There is also a focus on accountability through national level assessments. Next, at the state level, we have districting, which can become a very contested issue. We also have state level appointed leaders. States develop funding formulas, set standards, school calendars, criteria for curricula, and govern professional licensure and certification for teachers. At the local level or district level is where we have staffing, more funding, and input on curricula. Let's break it down by branch. We all remember the three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. In terms of school structure, think executive branch for civil rights and accountability. The legislative branch makes laws and determines funding. And finally, the judicial branch is there to balance the powers of the other two and settle disputes. There is much case law that has impacted education in important ways. Think Brown versus Board of Education and racial integration. No discussion of government's role is complete without mentioning three key pieces of federal legislation: the National Defense Act of 1958, which allocated federal funding for education; the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided funding to support equal access to education and thereby established the federal government's role in education. The 2002 reauthorization of that act, known as No Child Left Behind, which is probably something many of you have heard of. It was again reauthorized in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act, sometimes called ESSA, which is most known for attending to the needs of diverse student populations. Now let's talk about structure and staffing just a bit. We can say that education is mostly controlled at the state and local levels. This means we do not have one national system like Germany or Japan or many other countries, but 50 different systems. So keep this in mind when you hear people talking about how great such and such a country's education system is, and we should be like theirs. Our system is actually 50 or more different smaller systems and is not centrally controlled. Additionally, most states, including Virginia, delegate responsibility to the local or district level. This makes school districts the primary operating units of U.S. public education. In other words, it might be that we have hundreds of school systems in our country. School systems are usually governed by local school boards comprised of elected members of the public. The public's interest is usually focused on funding and accountability. The school district is run by a superintendent or other professional educator who is accountable to the school board for the district's performance and expenditures. Districts usually have central offices with various staff who support the district and superintendent. Within the district, there are many schools, and this is where we have the elementary, middle, high schools, and sometimes other specialty schools. Superintendents often delegate the operation of individual schools to the principal, who has various levels of autonomy over his or her building. Of course, schools are staffed by teachers and many other special staff, such as counselors and reading specialists, ESL teachers, special education teachers, and aides. Schools also have administrative staff who ensure the smooth running of daily operations. Okay, so you may have noticed the rather matter of fact and uncritical tone of this mini lecture, but no, nothing is wrong. And I haven't forgotten that we simply can't digest facts without asking some tough questions. This is college after all, right? You have heard me say that education is called the great equalizer in our country, yet it isn't working that way for everyone. We touched on this in the achievement gap and diversity mini lectures. So far on this course, we have worked to expose how education can further emphasize our disparities, such as those in SES, race, and gender. We know that historically, education served really only one group of students, those who were white, middle class, or wealthy. Over time, and with varying degrees of success, school began to serve more diverse groups. Here we connect school structure to this larger process. So let's think about how the structure of the institution itself accommodates diversity and serves all student groups or not. Issues such as class size, teacher quality, teacher diversity, instruction, curricula, and funding are all structural issues that impact student achievement and contribute to the larger forces that create the achievement gap. Other structural issues we can't ignore include school safety. How must that impact the daily experiences of students and teachers? Discipline is another important aspect of school structure that impacts some student groups more than others. We sometimes call this the school to prison pipeline phenomenon. These are important areas that are worthy of further study. If you take just one thing away from this mini lecture and this course more broadly, take away the idea that we always need to ask who benefits and who does not. So I'm going to stop here so that you can make up your own mind about the content this week. And that's all, folks.